The spring of 1832 found William Sublette staring west across the Wind River Range, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the thaw. Snowmelt thundered down from the peaks, turning the plains below into a patchwork of slick mud and trembling grass. To the untrained eye, it was desolation, a place no man with sense would linger. But to Sublette, trader and mountain man, it was promise. He'd been called a fool more times than he cared to count. First for leaving street, Louis with a wagon train of powder, traps, and whiskey enough to start a small war. Then for crossing the Platte, when even the Indians said the ice would never hold. Now they said he'd gone mad entirely trying to buy up a fort at the edge of nowhere. The fort in question wasn't much, a ragged stockade of cottonwood logs perched on a bluff above the Green River, not far from the site the trappers called Horse Creek. Built in haste, manned by men who'd rather trap than trade, it looked more like a pile of firewood than a fortress. But Sublette saw something in it the others didn't: a future. He had ridden hard from the Platte country, his company's wagons trailing behind like a slow-moving river of ambition. His partner, Robert Campbell, rode beside him, younger, cautious, but loyal. They'd come to bargain with a rival outfit, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, whose luck had gone sour after years of hard trapping and harder winters. Men like Jedediah Smith and David Jackson had made their names here, but the beaver were growing scarce and debts were piling high. That night, as the wind moaned through the cracks in the fort's gate, Sublette sat across from Jackson by the fire. Between them lay a ledger, a half-empty bottle, and the weight of a dying empire. "You're wantin' to buy the whole concern?" Jackson asked, rubbing a hand over his beard. His face was thin, tanned by sun and trouble. "You'd have to be crazier'n a spring buffalo to take it." Sublette leaned forward, eyes steady. "Maybe, but the fur trade ain't dead yet. It's just changin'. You know as well as I do the rendezvous will come this way. This fort's in the path of the future." Jackson barked a laugh. "Future? You'll be trading with ghosts come fall. There ain't beaver enough left to keep a boy in traps." Sublette didn't argue. He only pulled a pouch from his coat and spilled out the glittering contents, coins, notes, and promissory papers, every cent his company could muster. Jackson stared at it for a long while, then nodded slowly. "You're a damned fool, Will Sublette," he muttered. "But maybe a lucky one." By dawn, the papers were signed. Sublette and Campbell owned the fort, all of it, from the rickety stockade to the broad green valley that stretched away to the west. They called it Fort William, though in time the trappers would rename it Fort Laramie, and it would become the richest, busiest, and most storied fort in the Rockies. The first weeks were a test of grit and imagination. Sublette's men tore down the rotted palisade and raised new walls from cottonwood logs hauled from the river bottoms. They built a blacksmith's forge, a trader's store, and cabins stout enough to stand a Wyoming winter. Every nail was hammered by hand, every board hauled on muleback from miles away. The locals, Crow and Arapaho, watched with wary curiosity. Sublette treated them fairly, trading iron and powder for horses and pelts. Unlike some traders, he kept his word, and word spreads fast on the frontier. Soon warriors and trappers alike were calling Fort William a place of honest dealing and strong drink, the twin currencies of the wilderness. When the rendezvous of 1833 gathered near Horse Creek, Sublette's gamble paid off. Hundreds of mountain men, half wild from months in the high country, came down to trade their packs of beaver for whiskey, lead, and stories. Traders from rival companies came too, drawn by rumor and profit. The valley swarmed with life, campfires by the hundred, songs, shots, and shouts echoing across the night. Sublette stood atop the new gate and watched it all with quiet pride. Campbell joined him, shaking his head. "Well, Will," he said, "looks like your foolish fort's found its fortune." Sublette grinned, wind tugging at his coat. "Ain't foolish if it works." Below them, the fires of the rendezvous blazed brighter than any city street back east. The beaver trade was fading, yes, but for now, the mountains still sang with the voices of free men, and the fort stood like a promise against the wilderness. By the autumn of 1833, Fort William stood firm against the sweep of the prairie winds, Its cottonwood walls, darkened by smoke and weather, rose like a scar of civilization in a wilderness still ruled by tooth and claw. The fort's flag, a hand-sewn banner stitched by a trapper's woman from street. Louis snapped in the chill wind above the gate. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke, grease, and trade. For all its promise, Sublette's fort sat on a knife's edge. The beaver trade was faltering. The best streams had been trapped near to ruin, and the British Hudson's Bay Company was pressing hard from the north, undercutting prices and buying loyalties. Even worse, rumors drifted up from the south, whispers that the American Fur Company, led by the cunning Pierre Chouteau Jr., meant to starve out Sublette and Campbell, flooding the mountains with cheaper whiskey and gaudier trade goods. William Sublette had faced storms before, but none so treacherous as those waged with ledgers instead of rifles. The trouble began when a party of trappers came riding in from the Powder River country, lean as coyotes and twice as mean. They'd been dealing with Chouteau's agents near the Platte and brought grim news. The American fur men were setting up a rival post only 50 miles east, promising trade prices so low a man could swap a single pelt for powder, ball, and a cup of whiskey to boot. Robert Campbell read the news in silence, then looked up from the report. "They'll ruin us," he said simply. "We can't match their coin, Will. Chouteau's got more gold than we've got powder." Sublette leaned back in his chair, boots crossed, a slow smile creeping across his sunburnt face. "Then we don't fight him with gold. We fight him with grit." He rose and stepped to the window slit overlooking the stockade yard. Below, a dozen men were repairing saddles, sharpening axes, and cutting firewood. They were not soldiers, they were mountain men, men who could fight, hunt, and build with equal skill, and whose loyalty was earned, not bought. Sublette knew each one by name. Old Fitz, who'd trapped the Yellowstone since before there was a Missouri Territory, Ezekiel Hobbs, a Kentucky rifleman with eyes like flint, and Joe Meek, young, reckless, and hungry for glory. "Campbell," Sublette said, "we'll make this fort a place no trader or trapper can pass without stoppin'. We'll have the best smith in the Rockies, the finest whiskey, the straightest deals. A man'll ride 100 miles just to trade here because he knows he won't be cheated." Campbell chuckled. "And if that fails?" "Then," Sublette said, his hand resting on the rifle above the mantel, "we remind them the plains belong to those who can stand 'em." Winter came early that year, a cruel one, with ice forming thick on the Green River by late October. Snow sifted through the cracks in the palisade, and every log creaked under its burden. But inside the fort there was life. The blacksmith's forge, manned by a wiry Virginian named Caleb Gentry, burned bright day and night. Sparks danced like fireflies against the frozen air as Gentry hammered out rifle parts, traps, and horseshoes. The clang of his hammer became the heartbeat of Fort William. Sublette understood something few traders did. Steel was worth more than silver in the mountains. When a trapper's rifle failed or a stirrup broke, he needed a smith more than a merchant. And Sublette's forge turned out work as fine as any east of the Mississippi. "Every trap you mend, every rifle you fix," Sublette told Gentry, "is a promise that Fort William stands when the rest fall." Outside the walls, the plains were a study in silence. Herds of elk and buffalo moved south, trailed by hungry wolves. The Crow and Arapaho camps drifted close for trade. Buffalo robes, meat, horses, and the fort's stores filled again. For a brief season, the wilderness and its men seemed in balance. But balance is a fragile thing in the frontier. It came one night in December, the kind of night when the wind screams through the chimneys like a dying thing. Campbell had turned in early, but Sublette sat awake by the fire, going over the ledgers. The whiskey barrels were low, the powder stores thinner still. He was just reaching for another log when the first shout rang through the gate. "Fire! Fire in the storehouse!" Sublette was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his coat and rifle as he burst into the yard. The night was ablaze, the trade house roof a sheet of orange flame. Men ran shouting through the snow, passing buckets from the well, while sparks whipped through the air like wasps. For a moment, the whole fort seemed doomed to burn. Sublette waded into the fray, shouting orders above the roar. Douse the whiskey barrels first, keep the powder dry or we'll all be blown to hell." The men fought like demons, hauling water till their arms shook and faces blistered. Twice the wind caught the fire and hurled it toward the main gate. Twice they beat it back with wet blankets and raw courage. By dawn the fire was out and half the storehouse was ash. Campbell, blackened and weary, leaned on his shovel. If that was an end dace, accident, I'll eat my hat. Sublette's eyes narrowed. He'd found footprints outside the wall moccasin tracks, light and fresh. Arapaho, or maybe hired hands from the rival fort to the east. Either way, it was a message. Someone wanted Fort William gone. Well, Sublette said grimly, they'll have to try harder next time. Through that long winter, Fort William held its ground. The men repaired what the fire had ruined, rebuilt the storehouse stronger, tighter, better. Sublette sent riders to the Crow and Shoshone camps, spreading word that his fort still traded fair and strong. And when the thaw came, the first trappers of spring found the gates open, the forge hot, and the whiskey cold a sight as welcome as sunlight after storm. By summer, the rival post to the east had folded. Its traders slunk back to Street Louis, broke and beaten. Chouteau's grand plan had failed to break the fool's fort. The mountains, it seemed, still favored the bold. Sublette stood on the bluff one evening, looking down at the valley. The grass rippled gold in the wind, and the river shone like a strip of glass. Campbell joined him, pipe in hand. "You ever think," Campbell asked, "what this place'll be in 50 years?" Sublette smiled faintly. "A fort, a way station, maybe a memory. But tonight, it's ours. That's enough." The two men stood silent as the sun dipped behind the Wind Rivers, the smoke from their fort rising steady into the cooling air, a signal to any who watched from afar that Fort William still lived, born from a foolish bargain and tempered in iron and fire. By the spring of 1834, the snows had melted from the Wind River peaks, and the world below them seemed reborn. The grass came early that year, thick and high, the rivers swollen with meltwater. For the trappers, it was a season of movement, streams alive with the flash of beaver, plains alive with the thunder of buffalo. And in the heart of that restless land stood Fort William, the fortress that had once been called Folly but now drew men like a lodestone. No one called Sublette a fool any more. Word of his success spread down the Missouri and across the plains. Traders whispered it in taverns at Street Louis. Young men heard it and rode west, chasing the legend of the richest fort in the Rockies. Even the Crow and Sioux spoke of the white man's stronghold by the Green River, a place of fair trade and good whiskey, where a man's word was as sound as his rifle. But the mountains are fickle gods, and prosperity in the wilderness is a thing as fragile as ice in April. The rendezvous of 1834 was the largest yet. From the Tetons to the Platte, every pass and trail led toward Fort William. By June, the valley was choked with tents, lodges, and wagons, a living city that sprang up from sagebrush and vanished just as quickly. Trappers came with their season's catch. Crow and Shoshone brought horses and robes, and traders arrived from Street Louis with barrels of rum, bolts of cloth, and dreams of fast profit. Sublette stood on the rampart one evening, watching it all unfold below. 1,000 campfires burned across the valley, their smoke drifting like a veil over the land. Men laughed, sang, argued, and drank until the night trembled with sound. To most it was a festival. To Sublette it was a sign the old trade was nearing its end. He turned to his partner, Robert Campbell, who stood beside him with arms folded. "Look at 'em, Bob," Sublette said softly. "Every man down there thinks the mountains will give forever. But the streams are near trapped out and the beavers near gone. There's a change comin', whether we want it or not." Campbell nodded. "You mean to sell, then?" Sublette smiled faintly. "Not yet. But I aim to be ready when the time comes." Throughout that summer, signs of decline were everywhere. Trappers returned light from the high country, half their packs empty, their spirits worn thin. The once rich valleys of the Snake and the Green had grown quiet. Beaver dams stood empty, the ponds drained to mud. Years of hard trapping had done what no army could, stripped the wilderness of its wealth. Still, Fort William thrived on what trade remained. The forge clanged day and night, and the storehouse filled with buffalo robes, elk hides, and tanned leather. Sublette, ever shrewd, shifted his stock to match the changing tide. He bought robes by the thousand, selling them downriver to traders who shipped them east for the growing cities. It was not the golden age of the beaver, but it was profit enough to keep the fort alive. It was then, amid this slow transformation, that fate brought a new name into the ledger of the West Thomas Fitzpatrick, a trapper-turned-trader, hard-eyed and lean as a wolf. Fitzpatrick rode in from the Platte country with a small party, dust thick on his coat and rifle worn thin. He greeted Sublette with a grin. "Heard tell. You're the man to see if a body wants to buy into a future." Sublette eyed him warily. "Depends what kind of future you've got in mind." "The kind with less fur and more freight," Fitzpatrick said. "Word is, the government means to open the trails west Oregon, maybe California. And every wagon train'll need a fort for supplies. You're sittin' on the crossroads, Will. You just don't know it yet." Sublette didn't answer right away, but that night, long after the fort had gone quiet, he stood by the fire, turning Fitzpatrick's words over in his mind. He could feel it, a new wind rising over the plains. The beaver trade was dying, yes, but the frontier itself was only beginning. By autumn, Sublette made his move. He and Campbell sold Fort William to Fitzpatrick, and a new company formed under William Drummond Stewart, a Scottish nobleman who'd fallen in love with the wild country. The price was fair, the papers clean. On paper, it was just another transaction in a long line of fur trade dealings. But for Sublette, it was something else, the closing of a chapter written in sweat, fire, and the raw courage of men who carved civilization out of wilderness. When the deal was done, Sublette walked the fort's yard one last time. The cottonwood walls still smelled of smoke and sap. The forge was cold, the anvil blackened from 100,000 strikes. He paused by the gate where, 3 years before, he'd first entered a penniless dreamer with a wagon full of powder and hope. Campbell joined him quietly. "You sure about this, Will?" "Aye," Sublette said. "We built it to stand, and it will. But I was never meant to stay in one place. There's more frontier yet." He mounted his horse and looked back once, the fort rising behind him against the blue of the Wyoming sky. "Take care of her," he said softly, though whether he spoke to Campbell or to the fort itself, no one could say. Then he rode east, toward Street, Louis and the next horizon. Under Fitzpatrick and Stewart, Fort William thrived anew. They rebuilt it in stone and renamed it Fort Laramie, after the nearby river that wound through the prairie like a silver thread. It became the beating heart of the frontier, a haven for trappers, traders, missionaries, and, in time, wagon trains bound for Oregon and California. By the 1,840 the fur trade had faded into memory, and the mountain men who had once ruled the wilderness were old, their beards gray and their rifles hung above hearths in towns they'd never dreamed would exist. But Fort Laramie endured. It watched the frontier roll westward through the Oregon Trail, the Mormon migration, and the coming of soldiers and settlers. It saw peace treaties signed and broken, tribes displaced, and the wilderness tamed by plow and rail. And through it all, the story of its founding remained a legend told around campfires and in trading posts of the man who had once been called a fool for buying a worthless stockade in the high country. A man who'd seen not what was, but what could be. William Sublette did not die rich, though he died respected. His body, broken by old wounds and fever, was laid to rest near Street Louis in 1845, yet his name endured on maps, in journals, and in the living memory of the West. His foolish bargain had built the richest fort in the Rockies. Yes, but more than that, it had built a bridge between two worlds, the wild and the civilized, the old and the new. For every man who rode west after him, chasing a dream through dust and snow, there was a bit of Sublette's spirit in his heart, that stubborn belief that even a single man, armed with vision and grit, could shape the destiny of a continent. The river ran on, winding past the old fort, and through the plains, whispering its endless song, the same song the mountain men had always known. A song of freedom, of struggle, and of dreams that no fire could burn away. The Summer of 1840 came soft and green to the mountains, a gentler season than most could remember. Snow lingered in the high basins, but the valleys bloomed with paintbrush and lupine, and elk calves wobbled on new legs. It might have been any spring of the old days, yet every man who rode west that year felt the change in his bones. The beaver streams were empty, the trade caravans smaller, and the once wild country was filling with strangers bound for Oregon. For men like Joe Meek, Jim Bridger, and 100 others who had lived by the rifle and trap, 1,840 was more than a year. It was the closing of a world. Word spread along the trails that there would be one final rendezvous, a last gathering of the free trappers before the trade vanished altogether. The chosen place lay near Horse Creek, in the valley of the Green River, not far from the fort that Sublette had built years before. They said it would be a grand farewell to the mountains. By mid-June, the first parties began to Ivnot River arrive ragged, sun-browned men leading horses laden with traps, robes, and what few pelts they could still find. Some had been in the wilderness so long they blinked against daylight like owls. Others came for the company, not the trade. They wanted one more smoke around the fire with men who understood the language of frost and solitude. Fort Laramie's traders sent wagons north with powder, lead, and whiskey. Thomas Fitzpatrick himself rode out to oversee the business, the veteran of 20 hard seasons now silver at the temples. Behind him came soldiers from Fort Leavenworth, missionaries bound for Oregon, even a few wide-eyed emigrants hoping to see the mountain men before they vanished into history. The valley filled quickly, lodge poles rising, canvas billowing, the air thick with the smell of horses and wood smoke. At night, the fires dotted the plain like stars fallen to earth. Fiddles scraped, rifles cracked in friendly matches, and stories older than the Rockies themselves were told again, each man trying to outlie the last. Meek, half-drunk and wholly merry, climbed atop a whiskey barrel and shouted, "Here's to the beaver that made us kings, and to the fools who'll soon plow his ponds into cornfields." Laughter roared through the camp. For a moment it was as if the years had rolled back and the mountains still belonged to them alone. Among the crowd that year were men whose names had become legend. Bridger, tall and hawk-faced, who could read a trail as others read a book. Kit Carson, quiet and deadly. Jim Baker, still boyish but already hard from winters in the Wind Rivers. They met like ghosts returning to their birthplace. "Sublette ought to be here," Bridger said one evening, staring into the fire. "He started this trade west o' the Platte. Seems wrong to finish it without him." Fitzpatrick nodded slowly. "He knew when to quit. Maybe that's a wisdom we never learned." They sat silent a while, listening to the wind move through the sage. Out beyond the circle of light, coyotes called and the mountains answered. Nearby, younger men talked not of beaver but of wagon roads of Oregon's valleys, California's gold rumors, and the chance to carve farms from river bottoms. To the old hands, it sounded like another language. Meek spat into the fire. "I seen what farmin' does to a man. Turns him tame. A field's a trap bigger'n any I ever set." Still, even he could not deny the pull of change. The world was moving on, and the rendezvous was its farewell song. When the tallies were made, the truth was plain. There were scarcely 500 packs of beaver in the whole camp, where once there had been thousands. Prices were poor. The eastern market had turned to silk hats, and the beaver's value had fallen like a stone in deep water. Fitzpatrick, ever practical, sold what he could and kept the ledgers tidy, but he knew the game was finished. That night he gathered the leading men around his fire. Bridger, Carson, Meek, and others who had written the first rough lines of the West. "Boys," he said, his voice low, "this is the last of it. No company's comin' next year. The trade's gone east for good." No one spoke for a long time. At last Bridger said, "Then we'll find something else. Ain't the first time the world's changed on us." He meant it, too. Within a few years, Bridger would guide emigrants to the Great Salt Lake and build his own fort on the plains. Carson would ride with Fremont and see the Pacific. Meek would become a lawman in the Oregon Territory. The age of trappers was dying, but the age of pathfinders had begun. On the final night, the whole camp gathered for one last celebration. Kettles boiled, fiddles sang, and the whiskey flowed freer than the Green River itself. Men danced with Indian women, shouted old songs, and fired rifles into the star-strewn sky. It was not sorrow they felt, but a fierce kind of pride, a pride knowing that they had lived a life few would ever understand. At midnight, Fitzpatrick stood and raised his cup. "To the mountains that made us men," he said, "and to the rivers that carried us home." 100 voices echoed him. Then silence fell, deep and wide as the prairie. In that hush, the wind carried faintly the rush of water, the whisper of the beaver streams that had fed their dreams. Some swore they could hear the ghosts of old companions, Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, William Sublette, calling from beyond the ridges. One by one, the fires burned low, until only the embers remained. When morning came, the valley was mist-wrapped and still. The trappers broke camp in small groups, each taking his own trail. Meek and Carson rode west toward the Oregon country. Bridger turned south for the Platte. Fitzpatrick lingered a while longer, standing alone beside the empty meadow. He looked at the trampled grass, at the faint smoke drifting from the last cold fire, and felt the weight of years. The beaver ponds would fill again with reeds. The mountains would outlast them all. But the brotherhood of the mountains, the wild fraternity born of hardship and solitude, was gone. He mounted at last and turned his horse toward the east. The tracks of the departing parties wove together like braids in the dust, leading down toward the plains and the slow current of history. Behind him, the high peaks caught the sun, glowing gold as a promise. The story did not end with that sunrise. The trails the trappers had opened became the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. The forts they built, Laramie, Bridger, Hall, became lifelines for thousands heading west. Their maps, carved in memory and blood, guided surveyors and soldiers. And their spirit, restless, stubborn, endlessly curious, shaped the character of a nation. Years later, emigrant journals still spoke of old mountain men who would ride out of nowhere to guide a lost wagon train through snowbound passes, then vanish again without pay or thanks. They were relics and legends, both living reminders of a wilder age. In time, the rendezvous itself became a story told by firelight, a memory of freedom that once walked upright in the mountains, carrying a rifle and a dream. The Green River still runs cold through its valley, clear as the day those men first saw it. Cottonwoods shade its banks, and the wind hums the same lonely tune. Sometimes, when the dusk settles and the water catches the last light, you can almost see them, the riders fading into the west, their laughter tangled in the breeze. The mountains keep their secrets, but they do not forget. For in every echo of hoof or whisper of pine, there remains the spirit of the mountain men, the dreamers who lived by their wits, who traded courage for coin, and who met the world head-on, wild and unafraid. And somewhere, perhaps, William Sublette smiles still, watching the fort he built and the country it helped to open, knowing his foolish bargain bought not just a fort, but the very first foundation stone of the American West. By the mid-1840s, the map of the American West was changing faster than even the oldest mountain men could have believed. Trails once known only to trappers and scouts now carried long lines of wagons, families from Missouri and Illinois bound for Oregon and California, chasing their own kind of fortune. The wilderness that had been the mountain men's domain was being threaded with ruts and fences. From Fort Laramie, the first great outpost of the plains, the stream of settlers flowed west in an unbroken line. Where once Sublette had traded beaver skins and bullets, the new merchants sold wagon tongues, bacon, and flour. Soldiers replaced trappers in the barracks. Women and children walked the same yards where Blackfoot and Crow once bargained for powder. The fort had changed hands and faces, but its heart, its promise of survival in a harsh land, remained. And though William Sublette himself had long since returned east, the echoes of his bargain still rang from those cottonwood walls. In the spring of 1847, Jim Bridger rode through the fort's gate again. His beard was silvered now, his eyes the pale blue of high country ice, but he sat a horse as steady as ever. He'd come down from his own post, Fort Bridger, to trade and take news. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Daniel P. Woodbury, met him with polite astonishment. "Mr. Bridger, I believe this fort owes much to you and your kind," the lieutenant said, extending a hand. Bridger took it with a rough laugh. "Aye, maybe. But she's a different fort now. Smells more of drill powder than beaver bait." The lieutenant smiled. "That's progress." "Maybe so," Bridger said. "But I'll tell you, Mr. Progress don't taste near as sweet as fresh air and freedom." He spent that night among the traders, swapping stories of the old days when the fort was a rough-hewn dream. He spoke of Sublette's first walls, of Fitzpatrick's forge, of the winter fire that nearly took the place to ashes. Most of the soldiers listened wide-eyed, the way children listen to tales of dragons, for to them those days were already legend. When dawn came, Bridger rode on east toward the Platte, where the wagon trains were gathering. As he disappeared into the haze, a young corporal muttered, "There goes the last of 'em." He was wrong, but not by much. That same year, a wagon train of nearly 200 emigrants rolled up the trail to Fort Laramie. They were sunburned, worn, and half-starved, their oxen little more than bones. To them, the fort was salvation, a patch of order in a sea of emptiness. They came with their hopes bundled in canvas, their children wide-eyed at the sight of a real fortress. The soldiers and traders watched them come and go. Some shook their heads at the folly of dragging pianos and fine china across 1,000 miles of wilderness. Others saw in them a future one that even Sublette might have smiled at. A trader named Lucien Fontenelle wrote that summer in his ledger, "Traffic increases daily. The fort no longer depends on peltry, but on the passing trains. The trail west has replaced the river of beaver." It was true. The beaver, once the coin of the realm, was gone. But a new commerce had risen: freight and supply, guidance and protection, the economy of empire. Fort Laramie had become the hinge between the old frontier and the new. And in that transformation, the spirit of Sublette's vision endured. He had built a post for trappers, but he had chosen its place for destiny. Back in Street Louis, William Sublette lived quietly. The frontier had left its marked scars on his chest, fever in his bones, and a limp from a wound taken years before. He invested in trade houses, advised younger men, and wrote long letters to Robert Campbell, who had also returned to the city's mercantile life. They were partners still, bound by memory as much as by business. In one surviving letter, dated 1844, Sublette wrote, "The West moves faster than any man can follow. I see our old forts turned to depots, and our rivers crowded with steamboats. Yet I do not mourn it. The wilderness was a hard teacher, but she taught well. The men who come after will build higher for the foundation we laid." He rarely spoke of regret. But when the fever took him in 1845, those who sat by his bed said he murmured of the mountains of snow on the Wind Rivers and the roar of the Green River thaw. His last words, so the story goes, were simple: "Keep the fire burning." Fort Laramie outlived them all. It became an army post, a stage stop, and finally a symbol, the gateway to the American West. Through its gates passed wagon trains, Pony Express riders, Mormon handcart pioneers, and blue-coated soldiers marching to wars few trappers could have imagined. Each left something behind: a nail in the wall, a name carved into a beam, a memory etched in dust. And beneath it all, the bones of Sublette's old fort still slept the cottonwood timbers, blackened by that first fire, buried beneath layers of adobe and history. By the 1852, when railroads were still dreams and the buffalo still darkened the horizon, old men in Street Louis taverns told stories of Fort Laramie's first days. They spoke of a trader who bought a ruin and made it rich, of winters that froze rifles solid, of men who fought hunger and loneliness and found freedom in the fight. And when they lifted their mugs, they did it in the same rough spirit as the rendezvous days, toasting the fools who dared. The West never truly forgets. Long after the fur trade vanished, travelers along the old trails would sometimes find relics in the dust-rusted traps, broken kettles, the iron jaws of a beaver set gone to ruin. In quiet valleys they found the moldering chimneys of old winter camps, and in certain light, if the wind was right, They swore they heard the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer from somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. Scholars call it memory. Mountain men would call it spirit. Each spring, the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale displays Sublette's ledger, still inked with the names of his men. It's a fragile book, browned with age, but between those pages lie the bones of an era. Visitors trace the faded lines with reverent fingers, trying, perhaps, to feel the pulse of the world before roads and railways. The curators keep one quote carved above the exhibit: "The West was not conquered, it was endured." So the story circles back, as all frontier tales do. The fort that began as a gamble in the wilderness became the cornerstone of expansion. The men who once trapped beaver for a living ended as scouts, guides, and soldiers of a growing nation. Yet beneath the progress, something of the old spirit survived the mountain man's stubborn faith in self-reliance, his refusal to yield to hardship, his belief that the wilderness was both enemy and teacher. William Sublette's name endures not in monuments, but in the quiet places: Sublette County, Wyoming; Sublette Creek, the ridges where his wagons once rolled. And Fort Laramie still stands, its walls weathered but unbroken, holding fast to the wind. On summer evenings, when the prairie grass ripples gold and the river hums low, the land itself seems to tell his story again, of the trader who bought a dying dream, of men who forged a future from it, and of a world that ended not with thunder, but with the sigh of rivers returning to their beds. A century and more have passed since the last beaver trap snapped shut in those mountains. Yet every spring, reenactors and historians gather at the Museum of the Mountain Man and the valleys near the Green River. They set up tents of canvas, cook over open flame, and tell the same old tales: the foolish bargain, the winter fire, the last rendezvous. And, when night comes, they raise their cups to the flicker of firelight and to the ghosts that hover near. Someone always repeats Sublette's last words, as if they were a prayer: "Keep the fire burning." And in that moment, the old world stirs again: the clang of hammers, the snort of pack mules, the laughter of free men under endless sky. The mountains answer in silence, proud and eternal. The fire burns on. By the year 1850, the beaver trade, the mighty engine that had drawn men across the Rockies and filled the ledgers of Street Louis, was all but dead. Silk hats had fallen out of fashion in London and New York. The streams that once glittered with traps now ran undisturbed through forgotten valleys. The mountain men, once kings of an untamed world, had become relics of a vanishing age. Those who survived the long winters and Indian fights drifted like smoke, some east to towns they barely recognized, others deeper into the wilderness that had shaped them. A few found work, guiding soldiers or wagon trains. Others simply disappeared into legend, their names carved faintly on cottonwood bark or carried in the stories of plainsmen. It was said that the frontier never buried its own. It just swallowed them whole. The last great mountain man gathering the rendezvous of 1,840 on the Green River had already passed into myth by mid-century. Old-timers still spoke of it with fire in their eyes. There had been music and whiskey, horse races and tall tales, trade goods and laughter enough to shake the Tetons. But even then, most knew it was an ending, not a beginning. A young trapper named Nathaniel Nat Perkins, barely 20 then, would later write in his journal, "We felt it every man among us. The trade was dying, the pelts not worth the hauling, and the rivers empty as a preacher's flask. But none spoke it aloud. We danced harder that summer, drank deeper, for we knew the mountain was letting us go." By 1850, Perkins was an old man in his stree, 30s aged twice his years by hardship. He wandered into Fort Laramie that winter, gaunt and hollow-eyed, leading a single mule. He traded a small bundle of pelts for coffee and tobacco, and when asked where he'd been, he only said, "Up high." The officer at the post noted that he stayed 3 nights and then rode west again, into the wind. He was never seen after. The mountains had taken him home. In Street Louis, merchants who had once built fortunes from fur were turning to railroads, mining, and real estate. Robert Campbell, Sublette's old partner, ran a prosperous business house. He still kept one of Sublette's rifles above his desk, polished and unloaded, as if to remind himself that a man could live rich without ever striking gold. In a letter from 1853, Campbell wrote, "We thought we tamed the wilderness, but she was never ours. She lent us her bounty, and we squandered it. Now the nation takes the land in earnest, and I wonder what will remain of the freedom we knew." The fur trade had been more than commerce. It had been a proving ground, a test of ingenuity, grit, and endurance. The men who survived it had lived by instincts sharper than steel. But now, civilization was creeping westward like frost at dawn, and with it came rules, roads, fences, the slow strangling of the boundless. Still, in certain corners of the land, the wild spirit persisted. Far to the north, along the upper Missouri River, the remains of old trading posts stood in silence. Fort Union, Fort Pierre, and Fort Benton, all names once spoken with awe, had become skeletons of commerce. Grass grew where beaver pelts had once piled high, and owls nested in the rafters. A surveyor named John Mick Stanley, traveling through the region in 1854, recorded in his journal, "The river carries no sound of the trader's hammer now. The Mandan lodges crumble, and the forts decay. Yet the land feels haunted, as though the very soil remembers the tread of moccasins and the laughter of the rendezvous." He was not wrong. Tribes that had once hunted and traded alongside the mountain men were changing too. The Crow and Blackfeet, long accustomed to the rhythm of the fur trade, now faced starvation as the buffalo herds began to thin. The Sioux rose in strength, taking the plains by storm. And through it all, the memory of men like Beckwourth, Bridger, and Sublette drifted in the campfire tales of both white and native alike, half history, half legend. Jim Bridger himself remained a living link to that vanished world. His fort, nestled on the trail that bore his name, had become a crucial stop for emigrants bound for Oregon and California. He traded in flour now, not pelts, in horses, not hides. Yet his heart remained that of a trapper. One December night, as snow fell thick as feathers, Bridger sat by his fire with a visiting missionary. The younger man spoke of schools and churches that would soon follow the trail. Bridger listened quietly, then said, "When I first come here, parson, the only law was what a man carried in his pouch powder, lead, and a mite of sense. Now you bring your books and say the land needs taming. But I tell you, it was never the land that was wild, it was us." The missionary made no reply. Outside, the wind howled through the cottonwoods like the voices of the lost. In 1856, the American Fur Company sent one final trapping expedition up the Wind River Range, a ceremonial venture more than a profitable one. Among the party was Baptiste Leclerc, a French Creole who had been in the trade since boyhood. He wrote later in a private memoir, published posthumously, "The mountains were quiet that year. No rival camps, no sign of the tribes, no fresh tracks along the river. We trapped for memory's sake. Each dawn I set my traps and knew it was for the last time. The mountains seemed to watch us go with pity. They caught few beaver, but on the final night of the season they built a great fire and drank to absent friends. Smith, Fitzpatrick, Carson, Sublette." The names echoed across the snow like prayers. When morning came, they buried their last traps beneath a cairn of stone. "To mark," Leclerc wrote, "where the mountain men ended." By 1860, the frontier had shifted hundreds of miles west. The Pony Express galloped across the same plains where trappers once hauled packs of furs. Telegraph poles rose along the Oregon Trail. Steamships chugged up the Missouri, bearing settlers instead of hides.